And really thank you to everybody at Apex Art. It's been a really wonderful time. It's been a year of pleasure and work and a lot of, labor that we all put into this. I think about a year ago, it was like November of 2022, we started talking about do you want to be part of the show? Can we make this happen? How do we tell these stories? So it's really exciting to see almost, a little over a year actually, the realization of this concept. And of course, counting with the help and the wonderful collaboration of other Venezuelans in the diaspora, not just in the United States, but Edinburgh, Oxford, Cornell, which is also a diasporic section of the New York state. And yeah, so I'm just really happy that you're all here. We're gonna, as I mentioned, speak in English mostly. If anybody, needs to, do a little Spanglish, Español también, we're gonna get in there too. It's possible. Now, I wanted to bring you all here today because as you maybe have been able to see, if you haven't seen the exhibit, stay afterwards. I really wanted to, work with different artists that are working and exploring these ideas of migration, of identity, of belonging, and not just from the lens of the economic, the socioeconomic, the political factors that cause the migration, but what does migration really mean as a process in of itself, not just as, the observers of, migrants crossing borders, becoming, different, hybrid citizens in different host countries, but being immigrants ourselves, really, which I think it's a very particular lens in which you can see this topic and not just from the outside, but living it as well. The other thing is that, as you can see, we really focus on telling these stories of migration that are very, very personal, that are intimate and hard and sometimes heartbreaking, but also a lot of, full of hope and still protecting or abstracting the image or the personhood of these different migrant subjects for many reasons, mostly, privacy, protection. These are very, difficult subjects too, so there's a lot of negotiation of how and who gets to choose how they're going to be represented in an artwork, who do you choose to be represented in your art as well. So I want to start thinking about this idea of agency, of representation, not just in an artwork, but also as a subject that is being studied as we, are talking right now. If anybody wants to go ahead, maybe I'll start with Ronald, actually, since he's one of the artists that's exhibiting. What do you think is that relationship, or how do you see the power of agency between you and the dynamic between you and the people that you encounter and collaborate, maybe, with your artworks?
Thanks a lot to everyone, to Fabiola also for coming. And also it's important these kind of places are able to present our projects or ideas, because at the moment Venezuelan diaspora is one of the most influent diasporas in the world. And for me, always the approach to follow your question is really personal. I think in the moment when I start to realize or think about the diaspora was also a self-representation, because I moved from Venezuela to Europe, and I start to realize many lack of information, who we are, why we are doing this, and who represent us. About because migrants always is kind of a person without voice, without representation. And also in my perspective or my personal experience was I moved to Switzerland. It's a country a lot of diaspora, different people from different parts of the world, and always these people, they talk me about their culture or their identities related with diaspora. And for me, I was kind of a kid in that aspect, Venezuela, what we are. We only have a beautiful beach or like really cliche or stereotypes. And I start to realize like the diversity like kind of big aspect or big scope that we have as a society. And I start to, because I moved to Switzerland in 2014, and the big wave of Venezuelan diaspora was between 2016, 17. So I think I start to move going on. My first step was in the south border between Venezuela and Colombia, because it's where all the migrants start to coming out. So my approach always is really nearly by friends, even family members. Like, I don't like to arrive in places like this colonial or pyramidal aspect, like I am the photographer, I am the artist, the researcher, I come to hear what. I don't know, for me it's really participatory, like what is going on, what is happening at the moment. Is, for example, and if you see in comparison, like all the research results I have from 2017 to now, 2024, here in New York, is completely different. The goals, I don't know, the dynamics of the migrants are using, how they communicate now, how important, for example, is the social media in the process of Venezuelan diaspora. So I think to conclusion my answer is like, I need part of my research is the explanation of the people, what's going on, because at the end they are they mark the trend. For example, I cannot have the same method from the beginning until now. Like, it's really, and also the Venezuelan diaspora is really fast. It's changing so fast. Like, everything is from, I don't know, from the last year I was in Ciudad Juarez, and now it's completely different. Like, for example, the same space, the same time I was in Ciudad Juarez, for example, now I cannot go because it's so risky. And already in September I was in New York, and now I'm here in January, and it's completely different, the dynamic, what's going on.
Thank you for that. And I know that, I mean, all of you work with these very specific thematics from your own perspectives. You two actually, collaborated with an article for a scene that we developed for the show, which you can find online, with dialogues on the exhibition. And you brought up this idea of agencyation, the British way of saying it. Would you like to, share a little bit about that? Like,
La pena. Okay. I don't know if is this work? Yeah. Okay. Spanglish. Let's see. So, I think that Ronald was saying. So, okay. There's a question there about representation and perhaps the ethics of representing and the knowledge that we are here and we work and move in very sanitized spaces where we have sometimes very little contact with the reality of the majority of the Venezuelan migration diaspora. And that's I think the backbone of my own research. How can I say that my experience is similar to the experience of millions of Venezuelans that are more and more traveling through the Darien? I think that's a very important part of what I do. And this idea of agencyation comes because we have been questioning how can we this idea of giving back voice to Venezuelan migrants or giving agency to Venezuelan migrants. And I think that is that premise or that thought rests precisely on the hierarchy of systems of representation, if that makes sense. And beyond that, I think that we've been talking these days. The question of can the subaltern speak? Can the Venezuelan migrant really voice really be heard? Again, rests on the premise that their voices need to adapt to these spaces of sanitized knowledge and representation. And I think that that's one of the things that we like to think. They have processes, there are processes of agenciation, not only within the Venezuelan migration, but in any other diasporic community and minoritized community, of political agenciation that just, it just doesn't, is not equal to the voice and the voicing and the agenciation that happens in the sanitized spaces. And I think that that's what we saw. There are objects that Ronald does a great job of capturing those moments and objects and processes through which there are these micro acts of political will and power, and are incredible. In that article, sorry, you asked me for Spanglish, and I am just going on and on in English. But there are acts, we in that article, we talk about how, for instance, that blanket with a tiger can mean so many different things, and it can mean a baseball team, right? It can mean
Los Tigres de Aragua.
Los Tigres de Aragua. It can mean, the precarity of perhaps needing something for warmth, but also it symbolizes courage and origin and the traits of the animal, and also the fact that is a vehicle for him to continue his trip, and that is sometimes obscured by this idea of the poor little thing that needs to travel. And I think that is, and then we need to combat that discourse by giving agency. And it's no, not really. There is agency there already. It's just that we need to discover it.
Yeah. Same with the voices, it's you can share the mic. But when we speak about, giving voice to the voiceless, is very, I really don't like that, phrase, which is often used, overused, and misused, because it's by saying that you're taking away the voice of the people who want to, tell their stories and who are. So I really like that matter of speak or thinking. It's not really about giving them, we're going to provide you. It's really about critiquing who is actually not letting you become who you want to become, say what you want to say. And so spaces like this and different, activities that we may do, it's not really about giving voice, but being a platform for their voices to, be amplified. We're kind of acting like microphones in a way. We're just passing the mic, so go ahead.
I wanted to ask if everyone speaks Spanish here, because, we could. All right, so we were thinking about objects because that's the red thread of the exhibit and of Ronald's work, and how these objects can empower migrants because they have to develop strategies at instances. They get rid of the objects in order to continue their journey. In other instances, they sell their objects to continue their journey, or they need objects like a blanket or a jacket or shoes or whatever it might be to continue the journey through the Darien from South America. And then I think it illustrates quite well agency when they arrived here in New York City, and maybe you can help me with this. Many migrants that come here in very limited circumstances still find ways of acquiring good shoes, nice shoes, or a cap, because of what that means in the urban landscape of New York City. It's a way of presenting themselves, finding a position in the city, and fighting, what is the idea of... sí, no, es que el cerebro está trabajando en varios idiomas y no sé. Yeah, like integrating themselves. That's a complicated word, but let's say there are strategies to insert themselves, and this has a whole narrative dimension in terms of middle class that had been here for the longest time and see migrants coming in and saying this is a very irresponsible act of spending money this way on shoes or on a cap. And I think these discourses are reproduced too easily. These very simplifying discourses are reproduced acritically. And what we are trying to do is to think a bit more, or complicate, hurgar en la complejidad of that act of buying the shoes, buying the cap. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think I wanted to.
I really appreciate you bringing the objects to continue with that. But speaking of objects and agency, Irina, you're coming from Cornell, and I remember a few months ago, I guess, you gave a speech at the university and mentioned the the acquisition, there we go. Oh my gosh, that's a totally museum term. I'm gonna get fired for not knowing that. The acquisition of about 30 something notebooks that had been given to different migrants in their process or in their journeys. And I would like you to, speak a little bit about that and what those stories mean in that agency that people are actually using this tool, this material to tell their stories.
Thank you, Fabiola, and thank you for the invitation, everybody, for joining us Saturday. I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes we confuse agency with full transparency and the need to have full access to somebody else's story. And we think that the idea of platforms for visibility means that those people become fully legible to us as either artists or, in my case, as scholars. And I think, and I tie this to the archive because this archive that we received, it came from an NGO called Todos Somos. Douglas Lyons is the head of that NGO. They had 36 notebooks that were handwritten by Venezuelans who had crossed into Colombia in 2019, and they didn't have a home. So they were looking for where to host them, and somehow they landed on Cornell because of the research we've been doing on Venezuela in the past years. And what we discovered is that, in fact, it's extremely difficult to work with these archives because they are handwritten, because we can't read sometimes the names or the information about where they're coming from, because a lot of the testimonies are, blurred. And I highlight that because I think that it's more important sometimes to focus on those difficulties than on the result once you get the person's story fully out. And when I look around, at least at your work, what I see is that, like a certain level of resistance to be fully open to somebody else's gaze. And I think there's a lot of dignity and integrity in respecting the limits of our own ability to understand and read and interpret and circulate that story. And as somebody who is an academic, I'm not an artist, can't draw for the life of me, but as somebody who has been working on with artists and written about art in this past 10 years, I think there is also an academic question as to who are we writing this for, and whether the people that we're featuring are the people who are actually capable of reading what we write. And I think it's the same question about the art, right? Like, it's not about just the art being here, like, are people who are there recipients and interlocutors in the conversations that these objects create. So I think, to me, the question of the diaspora and the archives and these works is also an academic question of writing and accessibility, and thinking more materially about the circulation of these objects and where the sort of social life that they lead beyond the theoretical framework that we try to build to hold them together. So,
if I could I add something there? So like we had like a very brief conversation, like a panel discussion panel here, and we did the same at a restaurant earlier today. And I think that there's what that speaks to what you were saying, Irina, is precisely the impossibility of fully understanding this very diverse and very changing processes that it is sometimes very impossible to understand from the theoretical standpoint of the academia, or this, again, the sanitized white space of the art gallery. And I think that, as you say, is more interesting, because that tells, that kind of points toward how theory is just that, how we can maybe understand theoretical frameworks, but then they might all come crumbling down. And Erick Ronald and I, we had been going around the city and trying to get a sense of the Venezuelan community here, and we've been trying to talk to them and meet them, and it's incredible, because many of the things that we, in the safety of the United Kingdom in our desks, they're just things that you don't, that escapes, you know, the framework of theory, escapes the divisions and boundaries of disciplines. It just escapes it, and that is, I think that's the most interesting thing, if we are to think about a decolonized and a decanonized art and academia. Those are the exciting things. How are those things escaping? Yeah, I don't know if that made sense, but that really excites me.
Oh, that's beautiful. So that brings me actually to this idea of, like, how do you marry or balance this visual or this intention of creating a more authentic, participatory, collaborative, real, narrative with the rigor of academia, of research, and the safety, and the protection of these very sanitized spaces, which, as you put it, Ronald, I think maybe you want to say something else too, or no?
Bueno, ahora sí voy a hablar español porque antes hablé en inglés.
Vale.
Creo que referente a eso es que desde mi perspectiva y mi experiencia como un investigador o curioso, que es como más me llamo, un chismoso, tratando de entender un poco nuestra propia diáspora, eso de que a veces la teoría o no entendemos ciertas cosas. Primero, mi opinión personal es que somos una diáspora muy joven, demasiado, como digamos, bebé, y los elementos o cosas que pasan son demasiado rápidos. O como, por ejemplo, reflexionando en estos días me daba cuenta como que, por ejemplo, Venezuela no es un país que tiene un invierno, ¿no? Y, por ejemplo, tú te das cuenta aquí que hay venezolanos que se están vistiendo adecuado al invierno, y uno, sin ni siquiera haber conocido que existen venezolanos con códigos de vestimenta de invierno, ya uno los reconoce. Y yo no sé por qué pasa eso, pero yo puedo ver un venezolano que está vestido de invierno y sé que es venezolano solo por ciertos atuendos, y es como algo que no lo puedo explicar de una manera de teoría, porque... Y yo nunca, nadie creo que había visto un venezolano vestido de invierno, bueno, a menos que sea en Europa o este tipo de cosas.
Sí.
Como lo que hablábamos de estos códigos de que les gusta utilizar como los gorritos de Brooklyn, o hay unas maneras como y son demasiado rápidos los elementos que construyen. Por ejemplo, algo que me llama a mí mucho la atención es que en Venezuela, porque una investigación que yo hice previa, que es algo vinculado con la ciudad, las ciudades, por ejemplo Caracas, la moto es como un símbolo que está vinculado a muchas dinámicas sociales, y en Venezuela se maneja moto de cambio, o sea, de moto de velocidad. Es como el estandarte así de que... Y hay como una terminología que los venezolanos dicen, incluyendo las mujeres, que la moto que es como automática, moto de chola, eso es moto de mujer. Pero aquí está pasando algo, que la moto que utiliza el migrante venezolano es esa moto automática. Entonces ya ahora hay también un elemento identificativo que tú puedes entender rápidamente. Entonces hay cosas que ya se ha escrito, se ha teorizado mucho, y acá la están haciendo las mismas personas, pero que tienen otro significado, y son objetos, son elementos. Entonces yo interpelaba eso a los venezolanos. Yo les decía, mira, pero si tú ves a alguien manejando esa moto en Venezuela, la moto automática, no, eso es moto de jeva. Ajá, ¿y aquí por qué tú la usas? Y se quedan, y qué bueno, porque es lo que se puede pagar, ¿no? O lo de la gasolina, unas que son como híbridas, semieléctricas. Pero es interesante como ya está sucediendo, y todas esas cosas pasan muy rápido, demasiado rápido.
Y yo creo que el movimiento es lo que permite esa migración, no solamente física ni geográfica, pero migración de cultura, migración de creencias. Like, I'm just saying how, like, migration allows for not just the bodies to move through geography, but to actually move, or like cultures and beliefs move as well. And these kinds of dynamics of like, oh, in Venezuela, if you drive this kind of motorcycle, that's like a girl cycle. But here, it's the one that's affordable, it's the one that's more accessible, it's the one that's easier maybe to navigate. And also it's about the access of, who are, we're group people, we like start to do what other people do. So maybe, like that's what some folks could afford, and that becomes kind of like a new norm for the ones that are arriving. What would that look like in a few years from now? Erick.
Estaba pensando en mi propio trabajo académico como científico social, y en la necesidad de venir al campo y ver qué está pasando en la realidad, medirle el pulso a la realidad que quiero investigar, sobre la que quiero producir teoría, porque es absolutamente necesario, creo, o pienso, me he dado cuenta que la investigación académica tiene que ser como una danza entre la teoría y la realidad empírica. Teorizas, tal vez desarrollas un marco teórico para analizar la realidad, pero luego tienes que visitar el campo y reajustar ese marco teórico, porque si no es muy fácil quedarte, ¿sabes?, en el escritorio en Oxford, en esos espacios sanitizados, y producir teoría, y tal vez es teoría muy interesante, muy inteligente, pero que está desfasada de la realidad, y puedes desarrollar toda una carrera teorizando así, y puedes tener un trabajo súper inteligente, interesante, sofisticado, pero que no se corresponde completamente con la realidad, y es un peligro verdadero, creo. Venir aquí por 10 días a conversar con las personas que están viviendo en los Chester me parece fundamental para yo volver a Oxford y entonces empezar a metabolizar un poco esa información y conectar la teoría a la realidad empírica. Y luego volver por un periodo de tiempo más largo y con una idea clara, porque el riesgo es es muy cierto, es muy verdadero, es muy tangible de que si nos quedamos en el escritorio, bueno, vamos a terminar meando fuera el perol.
I'm interested. So, yo estoy interesado. I'm really interested in what Ronald was saying. And we've been talking about that a lot and talking about that with other Venezuelans that we've encountered outside shelters. And is that kind of how the reality of migration presents sometimes conditions in which your codes of behavior and the way that you perform identity and the way that you construct identity, they need to be different, right? So, for instance, la moto que no tiene cambios es una moto de geo. Entonces, ahora how do you perform masculinity? How do you perform masculinity, and what does that mean in terms of the identity of male Venezuelans, right? So, and then how do you how the impact that has in the production of culture is really interesting, and I think that that's something that perhaps Irina, I guess you're really interested in. You've written a lot about, of course, the production of culture, and that for me is really, really interesting. How do we start to, like, the only way for us to understand, for instance, the culture that might result from those performances of gender are now mediated by that other reality, the reality that now Venezuelans need to come up with Venezuelan ways, or ways of looking Venezuelan while dressing up for winter. So, yeah.
I maybe want to push a little bit with that, because I think there's a danger in thinking that the only reinterpretations or malleability that we associate with Venezuelan identity are in the diaspora. Like, I think there has been, like, in Venezuela itself, various experiences and experiments as to what identity and Venezuelanness is, especially if you look across history, especially if you think about the dominance of a very capital-centric scholarship in terms of what Venezuela is. So I actually had no idea that the motorcycle is like una pa una jeva. I had no idea that that was a thing. But also because I have not had a motorcycle and I'm from Mérida. So I think that it's important to also acknowledge that in Venezuela itself, identity has never been static, and that people have been experimenting with it for a long time. What the diasporic discourse does is that when faced with an other that demands your own legibility, then you start having to pick and choose what that is going to look like. But I would be very hesitant to say that that's something that we're just seeing now. I think that we have been in this negotiation for a long time, and I think it's important to historicize those kind of shifts, also to understand that there are people back home who are also experimenting with these identities because of the relationship that the diaspora is building with people in Venezuela. So, and again, to go back to the work that surrounds us today, I think something that it encourages us to think about is the lack of boundaries that we see in these images and in this artwork, and the creative potential in those gaps that open a conversation to the people there as well, which I think often get forgotten when we put so much emphasis on those of us who are over here. Yeah. So,
I think you brought up some things really important. I mean, Ronald has traveled. You guys, are from Caracas, Mérida. I'm from El Zulia, Maracaibo, and Cabimera, but and everything else. But yes, there's this la hegemonía caraqueña. Like, there is the hegemony of Caracas, and like all the stories that come out or that have been at least more formally exploited in a way and exposed have come from the capital, and that exists in Venezuela with like el típico Caracas, lo demás es Monteculebra. Like, Caracas is Caracas and everything else is just jungle, snakes, nothing else exists. So coming not from Caracas, not having ties to Caracas, you know, maybe like I went a couple of times because I used to work for Amnesty International. I actually used to go to Caracas because there wasn't an Amnesty International office in my state. I actually started it after 2 years. They were like, you don't live here? I was like, no, I come here, take a bus, volunteer, do stuff, and then go back. Like, do you want to start one there? Like, stop, like that's a lot. So I did, and so thank you for bringing that up. And actually, we're sitting actually in front of this piece. Right behind us, Juan Diego, who Maracucho, also living in Minnesota. He actually has remixed. This is kind of like a lyrical collage of different regional anthems. In Venezuela, we have, you know, obviously Gloria al Bravo Pueblo, the national anthem, very, you know, popular. But if you know, are familiar, every region, every state has their own state anthem, el himno del Zulia, el himno de Carabobo, el himno, blah, blah, blah. And so what he has done, not only has, you know, he taken different lines to like reconstruct new stanzas, new, no párrafos, una estanza, with like a line from Mérida, maybe you'll see something about the Amazon, maybe the Andes, you'll see sobre palmas y lauros de oro, like that's el Zulia. It does bring together this idea of a disparate Venezuela and a very separate, you know, conversation or identity that is not monolithical, but this is like a really interesting way of bringing all of those different not pseudo, but like sub-identity, or sometimes not even sub, like fully strong identities that are very regionalistic. You're from Margarita, and like you were telling me how you were kind of like tested by some folks you met here in New York. Like, are you really from the island? Like, tell me about the geography. Tell me, well, like, where did you live? Like, to try to prove that there's not one way of being Venezuelan. There's not one way of being diasporic Venezuelan. Ronald, you've mentioned, you know, we're very young, and also very not just new in like, oh, it's been a very recent diaspora boom, but we don't really have a history of a Venezuelan diaspora, period. You know, we're just starting it, and you guys are one of those people that are very curious. It makes me very excited to see what will the future hold and what will be written from a different perspective. So I wanted to ask, what do you think is your role as a migrant, curious person, academic, artist, mix of both, chismoso, aquí están puras chismosas. What do you think is your role to engage these different narratives and break from the colonized, the studious, and I will study you as a subject versus I'm going through this process and I'm breaking with all of these different barriers, which, may I say, have definitely been studied in Venezuela, but I think also migrating opens a lot of eyes, because now we can see from a distance with a little bit more of, you know, time maybe to process and to realize, like, we said a lot of like weird shit. Sorry, in Venezuela. El mito de café con leche, like all these things that we're like surrounded by in the country. Outside, we have like a time to breathe and break away from like, nobody's telling me in my ear, and you're not seeing like, la mujer es más bella, café con leche, todos estamos mezclados. Like, you can actually now see the different matices y los diferentes colores y como que ideas. So what do you think your role is as an artist, scholar, researcher, curious, chismoso, into bringing these stories together and breaking away from that colonial perspective? Not everybody at the same time, though.
Yo puedo empezar a pensar en voz alta, desordenadamente, y los otros me pueden ayudar. Soy bastante escéptico de que se puede conseguir hacerlo, o sea, romper con esos, con los parámetros eurocéntricos, logocéntricos, coloniales. Sin embargo, se puede jugar, ¿no?, a probar las fronteras académicas y tratar de descubrir, de abrir intersticios, ¿no?, donde opera una lógica diferente, una lógica menos, sí, bueno, como dije, eurocéntrica o logocéntrica. Esto es algo que tocamos sobre lo que hablamos hace poco, y tú mencionabas que a través del trabajo de Ronald pasa un poco eso, en el que se abren espacios para pensar, donde no está todo, no hay una lógica, no hay un dictamen de cómo se interpreta esto, no hay una medida clara científica positivista, sino que hay una invitación a pensar y a trascender en cierta medida, posiblemente, esas fronteras. ¿Ustedes agregarían algo? ¿O no?
Yo creo que partiendo de eso, algo que he venido también viendo y que soy partícipe de eso, digamos, de esa narrativa generacional, como se puede llamar, diáspora de identidad, es que muchas veces se olvida o también se invisibiliza la opinión que sería como el punto de partida, que es Venezuela misma. Y para mí es súper importante que esto también entre en diálogo en Venezuela. Entonces está pasando mucho que ahora todos como académicos, artistas, cualquier vaina que se habla de la migración no se vincula con Venezuela. Es como en estos espacios, no sé, Miami, Madrid, o no sé, hasta en Nueva York. Y al final es como que un poco ignorando, como que bueno, esta gente no sabe, está allá, pues sigue metida en el peo. Y se ignora esa visión, y por eso recientemente para mí era muy importante que esto se discutiese allá, porque a lo mejor la gente que está en diáspora o que no ha vuelto mucho, ahora la migración venezolana también es algo que el venezolano consume y que es parte de la cultura. O sea, mis primos, mis panas, o sea, que estamos allá en Caracas, a veces nos enteramos igual de rápido que ustedes de lo que está pasando en Times Square o lo que está pasando en el Darién, y intervenimos y opinamos y queremos como buscar ese diálogo. Pero creo que en la parte tanto de la academia o arte o cualquier cosa que no se toma en cuenta esa opinión. Para mí creo que eso es parte como de mi rol, porque bueno, yo vivo entre Suiza y Venezuela y ahora vengo más para acá, pero para mí es igual de que sea, para mí es súper importante que sea transversal esa opinión, no porque como que alguien digamos de un contexto Maracaibo, Mérida o Caracas que nunca ha migrado no puede opinar de la migración. ¿Por qué no? Si eso es un tema que todo el mundo, porque el que se queda también padece de eso, de una manera u otra.
Sí, pensar en la migración, por supuesto que le afecta a todo el mundo, y ahorita estamos hablando de casi un tercio, una tercera parte del país vive afuera del país, lo que significa, ¿verdad?, un 30%, que, bueno, casi más de 30%, 8 millones estamos más o menos en un país de 30. No hay nadie en Venezuela, me atrevo a decir, que no tenga un amigo, un familiar, alguien que esté afuera, que tenga una conexión. Entonces hay una conexión directa con la migración desde el punto familiar, amigo, profesor, la gente que se ha ido. Y, por supuesto, como que el ánima, el espíritu de Venezuela está derramado. ¿Cómo no va a afectar al país? La geografía no limita esta sensación de pérdida, casi que...
Pero también hay como otra cosa que se construye. Yo que vivo en Caracas, por ejemplo, la otra vez me pasó una vaina muy graciosa, que es que fui para casa de un amigo y tenía un primo que había vuelto de Perú y el chamo estaba haciendo un lomo saltado. Entonces, y eso como cosa, o sea, por ejemplo, tú ahora puedes estar en Venezuela y bueno, porque tú te comunicas con tu tía y terminas viendo un programa de televisión chileno porque tu tía ¿me entiendes? O sea, como que los últimos, eso viene sucediendo hace como que los últimos dos años, porque hubo un tiempo que Venezuela, toda la gente como que hubo una salida, pues una expulsión, y los últimos años está viendo como una dinámica más péndulo. Gente vuelve, se queda, se achanta, viene para acá arriba. Hay gente que, por ejemplo, ayer estuve en Queens cuando ustedes se fueron, una de las chamas que tiene un puesto de arepa en la Roosevelt, la chama montó eso y se bajó para Venezuela y va a volver a subir. O sea, ya hay gente que hace este tramo como como rutinario, ¿me entiendes? Y esas cosas están generando un mecanismo de consumo e identidad que es con la diáspora, pero dentro del país.
I mean, I think it's true that the story of the migrations we are reliving it now is unique, but I don't necessarily agree that we haven't gone through migration before, because not only if we look from the 19th century on, but the amount of displacement in Venezuela from indigenous populations en el sur to people who are displaced from the campos petroleros, like the idea of losing your home as Venezuelan and what it means to be Venezuelan once you don't have that, has been in the country since its very beginnings. So I think as scholars, one of the responsibilities we do have, if we're serious about questioning the schemas we have used to understand these processes, is to look at those connections too. Because I think those are all connected. They're part of the same structure of who gets to be a mobile subject and under what conditions. So I think that there is that commitment to history that can be overlooked. But at the same time, it's really hard to stand here and talk about this without acknowledging the massive crisis of the institutions of education in Venezuela and the fact that the universities don't have professors, don't have útiles, don't have money, that students have left, that people can't really even make it to school. My mom is a law professor and she has to teach on WhatsApp because there's no money to get to the university for the students. So I think it's impossible really to even start this conversation without recognizing the material conditions that dictate the circulation of knowledge, even the knowledge that we think is shared. So, I mean, people talk about production, articles written, for instance, in Venezuelan journals as being really behind and not in the same quality as journals published in Chile or Argentina or Brazil. And the reality is that to get any documents, to get any current theory, it's all relying on PDFs that get circulated. And I know this might be like a tangent, but I think it's very much connected to, like, we can't think about these questions or even get to the point of colonialism or legacies if we don't first begin with the circulation of knowledge as we have it today. And I think when you're a scholar abroad, and at least I have tried to do that with many failures, is in which ways can you generate platforms where you can share those kind of knowledges so that there is a proper conversation and not one that is always going to be half blinded by the scarcity that we seem to want to sometimes ignore on behalf of having a very coherent narrative about what this is about.
Also, I think that I agree so much with what you just said, Irina. So first, in terms of the history, I think that we need to be aware that the history of migration in Venezuela shaped a lot our culture and shaped a lot our understanding of Venezuelanness and the canon of Venezuelan literature. And like I remember we had a very fleeting conversation that time we were at Cornell, this is something that I always mention, La Biblioteca de Ayacucho, which is the canon of Venezuelan, of Latin American literature, of the thought of Bolivar, of so many things that we associate with the canon of Venezuelan knowledge, was curated by exiles that were in Venezuela, by Rama. Then you also have the canon of Venezuelan literature itself was sometimes written in exile, like Teresa de la Parra, who was in exile. So I think that is naive to think that this is something unique. And if it's not the same conditions, which is an argument that is very valid, that is, yes, but it's not the same. Yeah, but I think that completely separating them, almost like le echa leña al fuego, it kind of exacerbates the spectacularization, I don't even know if that's a word, the spectacularization of the current situation. and the pain of the current situation, and the almost like the rejoicing in the pain and the spectacular thing of the pain of what we're living today. And yes, it is so it's difficult to ignore. It is so big. It is a phenomenon that is so overwhelming. But at the same time, I think that ignoring that migration, mobility, and exile is being a part of Venezuelan history is only underscoring that spectacularization of the pain of current Venezuelan migration. And then in regards to regarding what you mentioned about connecting Venezuela, I think that the precarities that are happening in Venezuela at the moment in terms of academic knowledge and reproduction and access cannot be ignored. It is so expensive for a Venezuelan scholar to travel abroad and pay conference fees and to get a book and get and keep themselves in the loop of traveling. I have the incredible privilege of being able to be here today and travel, across a sea from another continent to have this conversation and bridge the gap and have a closer relationship with Ronald, with Irina, with Fabiola. Not with you. But that's an incredible privilege that people in Venezuela, unfortunately, have a real difficulty having. And on that note, I also think that we tend to think about transnationality and the idea of transnational thinking and identity of Venezuelan diasporic people. So they think of Venezuela and they have this relationship with Venezuela, and therefore they have this new transnational existence. But so do people that live in Venezuela, as Ronald was saying. The idea of Venezuela spills over now. They know that they have this transnational experience, even though they are still locally placed in Venezuela. And that is, that's really, really important to remember, I guess.
You did bring up which is what I wanted to mention, was the issue or the point of privilege, because even though migration has existed in history of the world, not just Venezuela, migration is the most universal story since immemorial time. There are certain, passages in Venezuelan history in which, when we speak of exiles, we're speaking of political elite. Exiles, we're speaking of people that had a privilege to escape, leave, to move, to start businesses. You have like La Colonia in Miami. Like, these are not the same stories that we're seeing in this show. And that's what's been exacerbated. We know when we knew of Venezuela has always had migration. Venezuela was like, yes, people have always traveled, but how? And when? And why? What moved them? This separation definitely needs to be highlighted. And how privileged are we to be, able to be here, to be able to have this conversation, but also how do we bring it back to the people who are crossing by foot, a la gente de a pie, which is funny to think like that phrase, la gente de a pie, is like, oh, everyday people, is how we say in Venezuela. And now la gente de a pie se está convirtiendo en una cuestión literal, like the people who are walking to get to the United States. It's not the same, hacer esa de la parra. O hablar de cualquier escritor que, que vivió en París. Oh yes, it's not the same circumstance. So I think it's important, to still point that out while remembering our history and not, speaking. And also, when we think of exile, it's not just outside. You brought an excellent point, which is the internal migration that occurs in the country from indigenous peoples, yo tengo los dos, tengo Guayú, like all my family is Guayú, aunque no se me note mucho, y campos petroleros. Like, I grew up in an oil camp. I grew up in Tía Juana, mi abuela, toda la gente de Cabimas, de Ciudad Ojeda, is like a very specific culture. But you never thought, I never was taught either, until much later, of like all the people that had to be removed in order for companies to settle and like have all these houses. That when I came then to the United States, I've been in the US for about 12 years. and when I first moved here, I started walking around and seeing in like little suburban neighborhoods, Bethesda or like Hyattsville in Maryland, and suddenly recognizing the homes. I'm like, these are the houses that we have like in Tijuana. I'm like, oh, it's because those were American-built houses that, you know, were built in this campo, in this oil land area, en Lagunilla, Mene Grande, todo eso para construir then a new country that en el que estamos ahorita metidos, and then now are also sadly abandoned. Sí, por supuesto, pero claro, el hablar del tema migración de movimiento, pues, yes. Ronald, I think you wanted to say something. I saw you know, or no, you were like also.
Sí, voy a tratar de conectar el elemento de la historia como una necesidad fundamental en la investigación de la migración venezolana y lo que veníamos hablando sobre estructuras coloniales en espacios de producción de conocimiento. Voy a ver si puedo articular esto coherentemente. Y también es una idea que se está armando, así que corríjame si digo algo muy descabellado. Solo ciertos académicos se pueden dar el lujo de estudiar la historia y escribir sobre la migración venezolana con un trabajo reflexivo profundo que toma tiempo, porque, como nosotros, como yo, seguramente, porque hay financiamiento, hay funding, para que yo me tome el tiempo de hacer esa investigación, entender la historia y cómo la historia informa los eventos de la actualidad. Ahora, sin entender la historia, los eventos de la actualidad son alarmantes, como decía Fran, y pueden ser espectacularizados. Y esto lo quiero conectar con el tema de las estructuras coloniales, precisamente por el tema del funding. ¿Quién tiene acceso al funding y quién no? Si no tienes acceso al funding, como es el caso, en la mayoría de los casos en Venezuela, lo que vas a escribir es un poco sobre el espectáculo para venderlo, ¿no? Para poder conseguir algo de dinero que puedes tomar forma de artículo periodístico. No digo que sea un medio que empobrece la información, pero puede quedarse en esa dimensión espectacular del presente y alarmante del presente. Lo mismo pasa con otro tipo de investigación que está destinada al policy making, que se puede vender o es financiada por ACNUR, por este tipo de instituciones, pero que requiere simplemente de esa data de la actualidad. Y no hay un momento, no hay tiempo ni dinero para hacer la reflexión y hacer las conexiones con la historia. Espero que me puedan seguir. Y bueno, y esto reproduce relaciones coloniales en las cuales yo, por estar en Oxford, puedo tomarme el tiempo de estudiar la historia y producir teoría. Y en Venezuela, generalizando muchísimo, el académico que tiene esa necesidad económica va a tener que invertir su tiempo en producir data. Y luego yo, desde Oxford, agarro esa data, pienso en la historia, produzco teoría y yo quedo como el académico intelectual y el académico venezolano simplemente me está proveyendo esa materia prima. No sé si se vio la jerarquía que se arma ahí.
Claro.
Bueno.
Me recuerda mucho la dinámica del petróleo, o sea, tenemos toda la materia prima, tenemos toda esa fosa petrolera, pero afuera, o sea, es alguien más quien refina. Sí. Me parece muy interesante eso pero bueno.
Era para, como dices tú, hurgar en la complejidad o decir lo contrario. Yo creo, I do think that there are Venezuelan scholars still in Venezuela that con las uñas are producing very good theory. And yeah, of course, there are real obstacles there. Es difícil because of what we said. But I do think that maybe, I don't know, I would love to know more about what you think, Irina, but maybe, because I know that you were also in Venezuela recently. I know that you participated in a conference in La Católica, I think it was. I do think that there is work happening in Venezuela, and scholars are really trying their best, de nuevo, con las uñas, of producing theory and producing and circulating knowledge within their possibilities in Venezuela. Maybe it is not our responsibility, I don't think, but yeah, it is our responsibility actually to sustain those connections and to think about how can we, because we are outside and we might have, we are the privileged ones in this tilted scale. How can we then overcome those barriers and help? And we had a really good conversation with a Venezuelan scholar here 2 nights ago, and yeah, she was trying to push us. I think that also there is another thing there, and I know that you are actually also working with a lot of Venezuelans, new Venezuelan scholars as well, which I think that is something really interesting. But I think that there is also something to say about the more time it passes, the more removed Venezuelans are from Venezuelan academia, if that makes sense. So all of my academic life has been outside Venezuela. And that is a disadvantage in a way because I don't have the connections there. And I might read something, but I just simply don't have the connections. Que bruja, me robaste el agua. So
I would say that, I mean, those connections exist. I mean, and Farid is here, Farid Mereb, shout out. Just last year, we co-produced a book for the University of Carabobo abroad. You know, I was one of the editors for this publication that had to be online, it had to be a PDF because there wasn't enough money to print an actual book or to bring us to the country. And there were about 20-something researchers, scholars, and, you know, independent thinkers and curious chismosos to participate and actually be part of that conversation. So those like transnational dynamics are still very much alive. I grew up in the University of Carabobo. My mom was a professor in la universidad. And even though I wasn't part of the academic circle, you know, I graduated, I'm a lawyer, came here. And so I haven't been part of like circles of like the academic thinkers on this particular topic or even the arts. I'm always fascinated to like, oh, you all knew each other from back then? Oh yeah, I had no idea who any of you were. Thank you for wanting to collaborate. It's all very still new to me. But it's really fascinating to be able to continue those links. I want to, you know, give us just a chance to breathe because we're almost on time. And if there's any questions from the audience, or I don't know if people have been on Instagram Live things, we have a few minutes to get to you. And if we don't have enough time, you know, we'll share emails, social media, so we can definitely stay in touch. But yes.
So I'm really interested in the acquisition of the notebooks you were discussing. I was wondering what are the dynamics involved in objects gathered from the water and institution acquirement. Let's say I am familiar with all the implications necessary to incorporate new archives in institutions, but I do wonder in this case where are all those funds going, because I know there are a lot of fiscal regulations regarding who gets paid and how much and how. So it was just ringing in my head who, at the end of the day, benefits from these acquisitions, and what is your perspective regarding the availability of these materials in reading rooms if people are not being able to read them? Are the same funds for, let's say, and I know this is wild, descabellado, esta asociación, like 1,800 manuscripts and people decoding these manuscripts and then all these handwritings that you're not able to understand, are the same funds institutionally being allocated, or are these just being acquired as objects, not as manuscripts? I wonder about all of that, and I'm really interested in hearing your perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I'm also trying very hard to make this archive known because of the limitations that have come with accessibility. The archive was a donation from Todos Somos, so we didn't purchase it. And they went through various universities to see who had the space. It is hosted in the Rare Manuscript Collection, and they have never hosted in the history of Cornell an archive like this before, because it's an archive that is sort of happening live and that has the potential to grow. So the archive, in fact, has created a lot of really hard conversations between all of us who are involved, because there is a question of minors and how do you protect the minor's identity. And then there is a question of what if there is information there that can be used legally in terms of legal cases that are happening, with the question also of like, well, okay, but this needs to be made available so that people can actually access it, with the also question that, okay, but how much can you make available when the transcriptions are very incomplete because you can not read, right? So we are right now at the point where the archive is being processed and is gonna be open in September of this year. This is 1 year after the acquisition. We secured funding for one of our grad students, Valeska Solórzano, who is also an artist and photographer, to conduct the translations, the transcriptions, which I am also supervising, and it has been an extremely difficult process. But we're moving forward, and we hope to acquire funding to digitize the archive, except that we can't do that until we solve the legal questions of identity. And what the library has said is that we might have to hold off the digitization until there is some sort of policy at a university level as to what to do with this.
So are they accessible right now for scholars?
Starting in September, there will be.
But not digitally?
Exactly. So just so I'm using this to advertise it, but we're planning a lounge where I'm trying to do it in a way where I get to invite not just the people at Cornell, but people in the local community of Ithaca, which, by the way, has a lot of Venezuelans now, and artists or photographers or anybody to just spend time with the documents and create something with them, with the hope that even if the documents themselves can reach beyond the place right now, then there's work about them that is going to give them that kind of presence. So, but I say this because I don't want to shy away from the many ethical issues that have come up from this, and we're just working through them. So.
How would you feel about, can I challenge? How do you feel about archives like this being purchased in institutions and their accessibility to a broader audience? Like, let's say, the legal implications of digitizing pose many challenges to, you know, academics abroad, which is something we're discussing. So I just want to hear a little bit of your thinking regarding that.
I mean, I think we can't avoid the question that an American institution purchasing a Latin American archive is always going to be problematic. And there are plenty of archives in American institutions that have this question at the center. But then there is the other side of the equation, which is, well, where else are they going to go? Because thinking just right now about Venezuela and the state of the Biblioteca Nacional and the deterioration of the films that are there, not to mention the ones in the more local areas. So if Araya is getting deteriorated in the Biblioteca Nacional, which it is, the films that they have there, this is a separate project that I have, if that is happening, then where do you host this so that it actually lives on? Because the other question about this, in terms of the Venezuelan diaspora specifically, is that a lot of the work of recording goes through social media and through digital archiving. And while I think that's great, and I think that that has given a lot of power to the narratives, it begs the question of, in 50 years, in 60 years, what is going to be left for us to look?
Yeah, but recent digital archive is, and what lack of knowledge is regarding that subject.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But in this specific case, because it's handwritten and the transcriptions are very hard to do, there is a part of it that is very much tied to the materiality of the archive. In other words, there's a part of it that requires the presence of the people. And until maybe in 10 years, there'll be a way to figure this out where everything will be there, fully legible. In the present moment, the only way you can fully access all of it is by being in there. So
Yeah, everything.
right,
Everything
exactly.
is always in development. We're just starting. So if there's any other question or
Americano.
comment, yes,
Bueno,
go
Americano,
ahead.
colombiano.
I'm curious, based on other personal opinions or research or the art made, kind of like maybe your perception of the Venezuelan diaspora going into the future, right? Whether it'll look like any other diasporas or whether it'll be something completely different or what you're imagining, right? So like me, for example, I was born here, but I'm Colombian, and I've spent time in Colombia, and there's always this duality of ni de aquí ni de allá, or you start to embrace de aquí y de allá, right? And you all talked about that a little bit, right? Where it's transnational. But I also personally don't think that a lot of the Colombian diaspora, that is my generation, that is born here, thinks like that, right? Not necessarily. I think there's very few of us that want to maybe be more connected to Colombia. So I'm curious what your thoughts are for the Venezuelan diaspora in the future, one generation removed.
If I can, so I think I don't think this will answer your question. That's so bad, but I think that is something exciting, and we were talking about that. Is that in diaspora studies? Diaspora studies have kind of quarrel with the idea of how do we understand diasporas, right? Do we understand them on the basis of origin? No, because that's too tied to the nation. Do we understand them on the basis of return? No, because not everyone wants to return. Do we understand them in the basis of language? No, because you might not speak Spanish. I mean, I think you do, but you might not speak Spanish, and then you're still tied to that identity or aspects of that identity. And I think that in the future, what I would like to see is more and more collaborative studies, and we were talking about that just a wee while ago, that involve other things that are not solely theory, but are kind of across disciplinary boundaries that do not take the nation as a sole horizon, that do not see language as a sole horizon, that do not see even identity as a static thing, but start to think about how this, processes. How can we construct knowledge and construct ways of understanding that are equally unstatic or equally changing as these processes and these questions are. How can we understand diaspora in a way that is very much not static as the same as the concept is, as the processes of identity performance and construction are. And I think that I don't know, Irina was very much encouraging Erick and I to collaborate, but el me cae mal. But there is this idea of maybe we can bridge and understand new ways of producing understanding and knowledge that is like that. So I don't know about the future of the diaspora itself, but what I would like is for this diaspora to be an opportunity to think deeply about those things, about identity formation and how changing it is, and how can academia and art and knowledge reflect that kind of non-monolithic, yeah.
Sí, yo creo que el arte es una de las maneras mucho más como que accesibles para mucha gente, que quizás no tenga, incluso no esté en círculos de artistas, círculos de este discurso también que puede ser bien elevado o elitista. Yo que no me crié en ese mundo y que ahora trabajo en el Smithsonian, tengo ya como 7 años trabajando en diferentes museos de la institución Smithsonian. Yo recuerdo que cuando yo cuando estaba en Venezuela todavía, un sueño que yo tenía era ir a Washington, D.C., que es a donde ahora vivo, y tomarle una foto al museo. Yo nunca me vi ni siquiera entrando. Ups, me veo. Y ahora verme adentro era como algo inimaginable. Entonces, pensar como en esto, o sea, ¿cómo va a ser la diáspora en un futuro? ¿Qué va a ser Venezuela en un futuro? Venezuela geografía, Venezuela migración, Venezuela el híbrido Venezuelan American, que eso ya va a estar en un censo próximamente. Ya, o sea, estas nuevas identidades todavía van a estar construyéndose y me gusta pensar en que todavía no hemos imaginado lo que es posible. Sobre todo pensar que yo no tenía ni idea, ni un deseo de quedarme acá. Terminé, por asilo político y cuestiones personales en Venezuela, que después muchas personas también han padecido, pero recuerdo, o sea, ahora saber que estoy aquí, que no puedo regresar por ahora porque no tengo pasaporte y no tenemos embajada. Yo sé, como que formalmente, que yo tendré hijos en algún momento y van a ser Venezuelan American. Y mi esposo es un americano, un gringuito, muy bueno, uno de los good ones. Y digo, ay, ¿cómo se va a ver eso? ¿De qué puedo aprender de otras diásporas que ya existen, que están establecidas? ¿Qué puedo aprender del Dominican York o del New Yorkican o de los cubanos? ¿Qué ha servido? ¿Qué quizás no me interesa mucho aplicar en mi propia familia? Porque sé que eso es una pregunta que está personal y que también estamos estudiando todos, queramos o no tener hijos, pero tenemos amigos, tenemos gente y nosotros mismos vamos como a ir transformándonos. Ya yo tengo acá 12 años y yo no soy la misma persona, ni la misma venezolana en mi memoria o en mi cerebro, ¿verdad?, de lo que yo fui hace 12 años. Empezando con, por ejemplo, la creencia de que, no, pero ¿cómo eres latino si no hablas español? Para mí eso era como que obvio y ahora me doy cuenta de tantas razones y tantas complejidades por las que el lenguaje o la geografía o el derecho o el deseo de regresar o con quién jangueas no es el determinante o no es un factor determinante para pues crear esa identidad. I don't know, I think we're on time, pero si tienen cualquier otra pregunta, comentarios, questions, comments, we'll connect on the social medias, on the emails. Please talk to all of us. It's been a pleasure. I'm really thankful for you guys to join, and it's been a pleasure to have all of you here. Muchísimas gracias. Ronald, Erick, Irina, Frank, les quiero mandar un aplauso, por favor. Y muchísimas gracias a Apex Art por mantenernos aquí, por darnos la oportunidad de tener estas conversaciones y espero que se nos unan en los próximos proyectos, en los próximos programas que vienen. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.